A recreational caver squeezes through a narrow limestone passage somewhere in the hills south of Knoxville, Tennessee. It is the winter of 1980. The cave is wet. The walls are close. The beam from his headlamp catches the surface of a mud bank and stops. Not on a crack, not on a water stain, on a line. A deliberate, traced line. And then another. And then something that looks unmistakably like a wing. Miles from the entrance, in absolute darkness, on a wall no sunlight has ever touched, someone made this. 800 years ago, and no one has seen it since. Someone came here not to survive. Someone came here on purpose. The question is what that purpose was, and how far back it goes. There is a version of the Appalachian Mountains that most people carry without thinking about it. A long spine of green ridges running from Alabama to Maine. Familiar and ancient in a comfortable way, the oldest mountain range in North America, worn smooth by time, softened by forest. The backdrop of 100 folk songs, the ground beneath the Appalachian Trail. A landscape that has been looked at, walked across, and photographed so many times that it barely registers as mysterious anymore. That version is not wrong, exactly, but it is incomplete in a way that is difficult to describe until you understand what has been found beneath it. In the winter of 1980, a group of recreational cavers entered a stream passage south of Knoxville, Tennessee. They were not professional archaeologists. They were hobbyists, people who spent their free time mapping underground waterways, measuring passages, recording the geometry of a world most people never see. The cave they were working through that day was unremarkable from the outside, a low opening in a hillside, a smell of cold air and wet stone. The sound of running water somewhere ahead. Nothing about the entrance suggested anything unusual waited inside. They navigated a slippery mud slope, then a tight keyhole, a passage so narrow that a person must angle their body sideways, exhale, and push through. Then a stretch of ankle-deep water, then another keyhole, then a climb. At some point, the stream passage opened. The ceiling lifted. The air changed. They found themselves in a chamber that felt, by contrast to everything they had just squeezed through, almost spacious. And then one of them moved their light at the wrong angle, or the right one, and saw the lines. They were traced into a dried mud bank along the chamber wall. A deposit left centuries ago when the water that carved this passage ran at a higher level. The mud had hardened slowly, and the figures pressed into it had hardened with it. Lines that formed animals. Lines that formed humans, or something close to human. Lines that combined both, creatures with the body of a person and the wings of a bird, or the sinuous curves of a snake attached to something mammalian. No modern graffiti overlapped the surfaces. No historic inscription crossed the figures. Whatever these were, they had been sitting in this chamber, in total darkness, untouched and unseen, for a very long time. The cavers reported the site. An archaeologist named Charles Faulkner at the University of Tennessee, Knoxville, was called in to investigate. What he found, and what his subsequent work would confirm, was that the figures were genuine prehistoric art, traced by hand into the wet mud walls of what was now being called Mudglyph Cave, left there by people of the Mississippian culture roughly 800 years ago. The preservation was extraordinary. The cave's constant temperature and humidity had prevented the mud from cracking or drying past the point of integrity. The figures were, in their way, as clear as the day they were made. This is easy to miss at first. 800 years is a long time. But the strangeness of the discovery is not simply a question of age. The strangeness is the location. The standard understanding of Native American cave use in the eastern United States, at least as it existed in 1980, was roughly this. Caves near the Appalachians were used for shelter, primarily near the entrance, the first 50 to 100 feet, where daylight still reached and the temperature was manageable. Some caves showed evidence of tool production or food storage near their mouths, but the deep interior, the so-called dark zone, the place past the last trace of external light where absolute blackness begins, was assumed to be too dangerous, too disorienting, and too far from practical use to have attracted sustained human attention. The dark zone was, in the standard account, empty. Mudglyph Cave broke that assumption immediately. The figures were not near the entrance. They were deep inside the cave system, reachable only by navigating a series of physical challenges that would have been significantly harder by torchlight than by headlamp. The artists who made them had carried their own light source, likely torches made of river cane, a material documented in other prehistoric cave contexts, and had moved through tight passages, water, and climbing terrain to reach a specific chamber in the dark. They had then spent time there. They had made deliberate images, and they had left. No fire rings were found in the chamber, no food remains, no evidence of shelter or sleeping. The people who entered this space did not use it to live. They used it to make something, and then they used it to leave. That requires explanation. And the explanation, when researchers began to look for it seriously, opened into something much larger. A mudglyph is technically simple, a line or shape traced into pliable mud with a finger or a stick. What makes mudglyphs at Mudglyph Cave archaeologically significant is not the technique but the context. The images are not random marks. They show recognizable categories of subject matter, animals, humans, and what archaeologists describe as transformational figures, beings that combine human characteristics with those of birds or reptiles or other animals in ways that suggest deliberate symbolic meaning rather than casual play. The hybrid creatures in particular, part person, part bird, recur in Mississippian art across a wide geographic range, appearing in pottery, shell engravings, and stone carvings from sites stretching from the Gulf Coast to the Great Lakes. Seeing them in a Tennessee cave, in a medium as fragile and specific as a dried mud wall, placed the Mudglyph Cave images immediately into a known artistic and spiritual tradition. This was not improvised. It was connected to a larger world of meaning. Faulkner's investigation dated the art to the Mississippian period, roughly 800 to 1,000 years before present. That dating placed the cave use during a time of significant cultural complexity across the American Southeast, a period when large towns and ceremonial centers were being built, when long-distance trade in symbolic objects was common, and when the spiritual beliefs encoded in hybrid figures and ritual imagery were shared across communities separated by hundreds of miles. The cave art fit within that world. The question was what it was doing underground. There is a word that gets used often in these situations: ritual. Archaeologists reach for it when physical evidence shows deliberate, organized behavior that does not fit utilitarian categories. But the word carries a risk. It can become a placeholder, a way of saying, we don't know why they did this, so we'll call it ceremonial and move on. Faulkner and the researchers who followed him were careful to let the physical evidence make the argument. What the mudglyphs showed was not ritual in the vague, catch-all sense. They showed deliberate entry into a difficult and dangerous space under artificial light in order to produce organized symbolic imagery on a surface no one outside the event would ever see. The argument that this was meaningful, carefully, intentionally meaningful, does not require speculation. It is what the evidence describes. The chamber where the figures were found had no natural function that explained the art. It was not a good place to shelter, to store food, to find water, or to work stone. It was a specific place that specific people had chosen to reach, for reasons that the physical evidence alone cannot fully articulate, but that clearly exceed anything as simple as resource extraction. They came to make something. They made it in the dark. What changed the story of Mudglyph Cave from an isolated curiosity into a regional problem was what happened next. Faulkner's investigation and the attention it drew within the archaeological community at the University of Tennessee prompted a systematic question. Was this cave unique, or was it part of something larger? The answer came from a program of cave surveys that began in the years following the discovery and has continued since. A methodical examination of limestone cave systems across the southern Appalachian region, looking specifically for evidence of prehistoric human presence in the dark zone. The figures in Mudglyph Cave had been sitting in total darkness for 800 years. No human eye had seen them between the moment the artist left and the winter afternoon in 1980 when a caver's headlamp found them by accident. The question, once the surveys began in earnest, was simple. How many other chambers were out there? After the Mudglyph Cave was investigated, archaeologists at the University of Tennessee began systematically surveying caves across the region. What they found changed the picture entirely. It wasn't one cave, it wasn't one culture, and it wasn't 800 years old. One cave became 92. That is the number that the University of Tennessee Knoxville Cave Survey Program arrived at after years of systematic work across the southern Appalachian region and beyond. 92 cataloged dark zone cave art sites, sites where prehistoric people had moved past the last trace of natural light and produced organized images on cave walls, ceilings, and mud banks. The sites stretched across Tennessee, Alabama, Georgia, Kentucky, Virginia, and West Virginia. A smaller number appeared in Arkansas, Missouri, and Wisconsin. 92. Not one, not a handful, a network. The way a researcher encounters this number matters. It does not arrive as a single dramatic announcement. It accumulates slowly, the way a survey always does. One site logged, then another, then a third that turns out to connect thematically to the first two, then a fourth in a different state that shouldn't fit the pattern, but does. By the time the number reaches into the dozens, the original question, why did people do this, has been joined by a second question that is in some ways more unsettling. How did anyone not know? The short answer is that most of these caves are difficult to find, harder to enter, and physically demanding to navigate. The dark zone is not a place that rewards casual exploration. The passages leading to the chambers where the art was made are often tight, wet, and disorienting in the total absence of light. Many of the sites would never have been found by anyone who was not specifically looking, and for most of American archaeological history, no one was specifically looking, because the working assumption was that there was nothing to find. That assumption came from a reasonable place. Cave archaeology in the eastern United States had, for much of the 20th century, focused on cave entrances and shallow interior zones. Shelters formed by overhanging rock, or the first rooms of larger systems, showed clear evidence of occupation. Fire rings, food remains, tool fragments, sometimes burials. This kind of evidence made sense within the framework archaeologists were using. People lived near entrances because entrances offered protection without disorientation. The dark zone, by contrast, offered neither comfort nor resources. It was, by that logic, a place people avoided. Mudglyph Cave suggested the logic was wrong. The systematic surveys confirmed it comprehensively. What the University of Tennessee team found, site by site, was that the dark zone art was not a local peculiarity or a single culture's isolated practice. 3 distinct art forms appeared repeatedly across the surveyed sites. Mud glyphs, figures traced into preserved mud deposits, were the form first identified at Mudglyph Cave, and they appeared at 7 known sites, including some of the most elaborate compositions in the entire survey. Petroglyphs, images incised directly into limestone walls and ceilings, were found at a larger number of locations. Charcoal pictographs, figures drawn with burnt material onto cave surfaces, represented a third distinct technique requiring its own set of materials and preparation. Each form required different tools, different planning, and in the case of pictographs, materials that had to be carried underground deliberately. None of this was improvised. All of it was organized. The geographic distribution of sites corresponded almost exactly to the limestone karst belt of the Appalachian Plateau, the region where the underlying geology made caves possible. This matters because it suggests that cave art production was not a practice that happened to occur in some places and skip others for cultural reasons. It appears to have occurred wherever the terrain allowed it. The pattern implied by the data was that any sufficiently large and accessible cave system in the karst zone was a candidate for use. The underground, across a vast stretch of the eastern continent, was being engaged with as a specific kind of place. There is a detail from the Tennessee Encyclopedia's entry on prehistoric cave art that is easy to read past and difficult to forget once you have processed it. In one documented site, the art is located a full mile from the cave entrance. A mile underground, in total darkness, through whatever the terrain between the entrance and that chamber required. The prehistoric artist who made those images did not wander into a comfortable space near the mouth and leave a casual mark. They traveled deliberately with light through difficult ground to reach a specific location inside the earth. Then they made something. Then they left. That level of intention does not describe shelter seeking. It does not describe resource extraction in any conventional sense. It describes a purpose that the physical evidence alone cannot name, but that the physical evidence clearly reflects. The researchers working on the survey were careful not to overreach. The word ritual, as noted, is a trap. It sounds explanatory when it is actually a placeholder. What the evidence showed was deliberate, organized behavior that produced symbolic imagery in a specific environmental context. What that behavior meant to the people who performed it, what they believed, what they expected to happen, what category of experience they understood themselves to be entering when they crawled into the dark, was not something the physical record could answer on its own. For that, the researchers would eventually need to look at another kind of evidence entirely. But that came later. What the survey established first, at the purely archaeological level, was scale. The practice was not rare. It was not a regional quirk. It was not the product of one culture and one century. The art forms and subject matter shifted across time. The woodland period petroglyphs found at some sites predated the Mississippian mudglyphs by centuries, and their imagery differed in recognizable ways. But the behavior of entering deep cave systems to make organized images persisted across cultural transitions. Different peoples, different centuries, the same fundamental relationship with the underground. There was also, running through the survey, a persistent and somewhat sobering problem. No one knew how many sites had already been destroyed. Cave art is fragile in specific ways. The same conditions that preserve the mudglyph cave figures: stable humidity, stable temperature. Minimal air disturbance can be disrupted by human traffic. A single person walking through a passage disturbs the air in ways that dry out mud surfaces. Touch degrades petroglyphs. Smoke from modern fires damages pictographs. The early 20th century saw significant cave exploration across the Appalachian region that was entirely unguided by archaeological awareness. It is not difficult to imagine, and the researchers working on the survey were frank about this, that some number of dark zone art sites had been damaged or destroyed before anyone knew they should be looking for them. The deliberate choice to call many of the surveyed sites the unnamed caves was a direct response to this problem. Over 100 sites in the survey record carry no published location name, referred to in academic literature by numerical designations like First Unnamed Cave or 12th Unnamed Cave, specifically to prevent looters and casual trespassers from finding them. The academic community made the calculated decision that the value of protecting these sites outweighed the value of making them accessible. The art in the unnamed caves has been documented by researchers who entered with permits and protocols. The sites themselves remain, for most purposes, hidden. That decision has a secondary effect that is worth sitting with. It means that the art in many of these chambers is still functionally invisible, not destroyed, documented, studied, photographed by specialists, but invisible to anyone outside that small community. The figures on those walls have been seen by almost no one since the prehistoric people who made them. In some cases, fewer than a dozen modern people have entered the spaces where they exist. This is the inverse of how most people imagine historical discovery. The standard narrative of archaeological work is one of uncovering, bringing things to light, making the hidden visible, expanding the public record. The cave survey program did the opposite, at least for the most sensitive sites. It found things and then carefully did not tell anyone where they were. The protection is real and justified. But the effect is that somewhere in the limestone hills of Tennessee or Alabama or Virginia, there are chambers covered in images made 800 years ago or 1,000 years ago or longer that remain in the same darkness they have always occupied. The survey did not end with 92. The researchers who led it were explicit. The cataloged sites represent what had been found and documented as of the time of publication. The karst belt is large. The caves within it are numerous, and many have never been thoroughly surveyed. The number 92 is not a final count. It is a minimum. At some point during the survey work, The accumulating evidence began to push toward a question that the art sites alone could not answer. The dark zone images showed that people had been going underground across a vast region for a very long time. They showed that the behavior was organized and repeated and persistent across cultural change. What they did not show, what no mud glyph or petroglyph or charcoal figure could directly express, was the framework that made it meaningful. The reason someone would choose a specific chamber a mile inside a limestone hill, rather than any of the thousands of other spaces available in the same landscape. For that, researchers needed to find a site where the imagery was not just present, but organized, where the figures on the walls formed a coherent composition, told something like a story, or reflected something like a theology. A place where the underground space itself had been treated not as a surface to mark, but as a room to design. That site existed, and what it contained changed the question from how many to what for. The passage was low and wet, and it went on longer than seemed reasonable. The researchers who entered Devil Step Hollow Cave in Tennessee to document its art had navigated the approach to dozens of dark zone sites by that point in the survey. They knew what tight limestone passages felt like, the way the walls pressed in, the way sound changed when the ceiling dropped, the particular quality of the air in a chamber that had not been disturbed in centuries. They were not expecting to be surprised. Then they reached the panel. Not a mark, not a figure, a composition, a sequence of images that covered the chamber wall in an arrangement that, once you understood what you were looking at, felt less like decoration and more like the interior of a building designed for a specific purpose. The Falcon Warrior was the center of it, a figure carved into the limestone with precision and care, holding a mace in one hand and a severed human head in the other. The posture was not ambiguous. This was not an animal rendered in symbolic shorthand or a human figure in a neutral stance. This was a deity depicted in the act of warfare with all the iconographic specificity of a saint in a cathedral window. Around the Falcon Warrior, the composition continued. A face with serpents for eyes, a mouth full of teeth, wide and gaping, severed from any visible body, or perhaps not severed but disembodied, existing apart from physical form as a matter of theological statement. Wavy lines descending from the disembodied head. The overall arrangement was not random, and it was not decorative in any simple sense. It was organized. It had been planned. Devil Step Hollow Cave sits at the headwaters of the Sequatchie River in Tennessee. It is, like the unnamed caves, deliberately kept out of easy circulation. Its specific location is known to researchers and protected by the terms of access, not published in tourist materials. What has been published by the Ancient Art Archive and by researchers working in collaboration with descendant communities is the content of its panels and what that content appears to mean. The Falcon Warrior is not a figure unique to this cave. That is the first important thing to understand. The same deity, known by different names in different descendant traditions, but recognizable by the same iconographic features, appears in Missouri's Picture Cave, hundreds of miles from Tennessee. The figure appears in shell engravings found at Mississippian sites across the Southeast. It appears in stone sculpture and in the painted pottery of a culture that, at its height roughly 1,000 years ago, extended its influence from the Great Lakes to the Gulf of Mexico. The Cahokian world, named for the great pre-Columbian city of Cahokia near modern St. Louis, which at its peak housed more people than contemporary London, was a religious and cultural system with recognizable shared symbols. The Falcon Warrior was one of them. Seeing that figure at Devil Step Hollow Cave did not simply confirm that Mississippian people had used this cave. It confirmed that this cave had been incorporated into the Cahokian symbolic universe. Someone, a ritual specialist perhaps, or a figure with religious authority, had traveled to this specific chamber inside a specific Tennessee hillside and reproduced, in carved limestone, the central deity of a continental belief system. The chamber was not a backdrop. It was a location within a larger sacred geography. This is the point where the word ritual earns its use, not as a placeholder for the unexplained, but as a description of something specific, the deliberate construction of a meaningful space within the earth, organized around shared religious imagery, visited by people who understood what they were entering and why. The parallel that has been drawn by researchers, carefully and without overstating it, is to the interior of a church. The panels at Devil Step Hollow do not simply decorate a wall, they organize a room. The sequence of images, warrior, serpent-eyed face, disembodied spirit, tells something that functions like a story or a liturgy, or a catechism, a structured presentation of theological content in a space designed to receive it. Whether the people who entered this chamber did so alone or in small groups, whether they came to perform ceremonies or to experience a form of contact with the figures depicted, is not something the physical record can confirm. But the physical record confirms that this space was designed to be experienced. It was built for an audience, even if that audience was always small, always arrived in the dark, and always left no name. The falcon warrior figure at Devil Step Hollow holds specific significance for the descendant communities whose ancestors created the Mississippian religious world. The figure is known in some traditions as Morning Star, and in Muskogean belief as a war god, the son of Red Horn, a cosmological figure associated with heroic action, the cycle of death and renewal, and the relationship between the living world and whatever lay beyond it. The held mace and the severed head are not gratuitous images of violence. They are the specific attributes of a specific deity, as recognizable within their tradition as a cross or a crescent within theirs. Depicting them underground, in a space accessible only through significant physical effort, placed them in a context that amplified their meaning. That context, the underground itself, is central to understanding why these chambers were used at all. And this is where the physical archaeology begins to intersect with something that the physical evidence cannot produce on its own: the explanatory framework of the people who made these spaces. The Cherokee are among the descendants of the Mississippian cultural world. Their oral tradition, documented by ethnographers beginning in the late 19th century, describes caves and underground spaces as thresholds, places where the boundary between the living world and the world of spirits became permeable. The water that came from underground was different from surface water. The animals that lived in caves, creatures that existed without light, that navigated the world by other means, occupied a category apart from ordinary animals. The underground was not simply a physical space. It was an ontological one, a place where different rules applied, where contact with powers inaccessible at the surface became possible. This framework does not prove what the Mississippian artists believed when they entered the dark zone. Culture changes over centuries, and the precise beliefs of a painter working at Devil Step Hollow 1,000 years ago cannot be recovered by reading later Cherokee oral tradition backward. But the framework offers something the physical evidence alone cannot: a way of understanding why a specific location inside a cave would be considered worth the effort of reaching it. If the underground was the threshold to the spirit world, then creating a room inside it, a room organized around the figures of that world, a room that required physical commitment and darkness to enter, was not strange at all. It was the most direct available act of contact. Alan Kressler, a researcher with the United States Geological Survey, who spent years documenting southeastern cave art, described the experience of entering the Devil Step Hollow chamber in terms that are worth registering. The panels organize the space in the way that artwork in a modern church aims to shape the experience of visitors and open their hearts to a larger spiritual experience. The setting is glorious. The art is specific. The composition is complete. Complete is the important word. Many dark zone sites show individual figures or small clusters of marks. Devil Step Hollow shows a finished room. Whatever was done in this space, the people who prepared it understood what they were building before they built it. They arrived with a plan. They executed it in the dark. They left it for whatever came after. A Cherokee cultural liaison named Bo Carroll, a member of the Eastern Band, born and raised on Cherokee-owned territory in North Carolina, entered Devil Step Hollow Cave during a documentation visit as part of the collaborative research between the University of Tennessee and descendant communities. When he reached the Falcon Warrior panel, he pulled from his pocket a pouch of tobacco that had been consecrated by Cherokee elders and spread it across the cave floor. Then he turned and crawled back out. He did not explain the gesture to the researchers present. He did not need to. The panel on the wall had been waiting in the dark for 1,000 years. He knew what it was. The Cahokian religious world, which produced the Falcon Warrior and the visual grammar surrounding him, was the largest and most complex pre-Columbian cultural system in eastern North America. The fact that its sacred geography included caves, that its theological imagery was reproduced underground across a network of dark chambers spanning 6 states, says something specific about how the people who held these beliefs understood the structure of the world. The surface was one layer, below it was another. And the underground was not simply the physical interior of the earth. It was a space that operated by different principles, that held different kinds of presence, and that rewarded the effort of reaching it in ways the surface could not replicate. This is not speculation. It is the most coherent reading of the physical record, of 92 cataloged sites, of organized compositions like the one at Devil Step Hollow, of a pattern that persists across centuries and cultural transitions. People came here on purpose. They came with images in mind. They left those images in the most difficult, most deliberate, most committed locations they could reach. But the Mississippian period was not the beginning, and the caves of the Dark Zone Art Network, extraordinary as they are, were not the oldest chapter in the Appalachian underground story. For that, the investigation had to move north, to a place where the record did not begin 800 years ago, or 1,000, but nearly 5,000, and where the question of what people were doing underground became, if anything, more difficult to answer. The bag was found on the floor of a dry passage deep inside Mammoth Cave, Kentucky. It was woven, grass or plant fiber, the exact material confirmed by analysis, and it was small enough to hold in one hand. Inside, it were traces of gypsum, white mineral dust, fine and crystalline, the kind that forms on cave walls when sulfate-rich water evaporates slowly over long periods. The bag was approximately 3,000 years old. It looked like something left behind after a day's work. That is the image to hold before anything else, not the abstract fact of ancient cave use. The bag. The woven vessel that someone carried through passages of total darkness in a cave system that extended for miles beneath the Kentucky hills, filled it with mineral crystals they had scraped from the walls, and then, for reasons that have been the subject of serious archaeological debate for decades, either left behind or dropped on their way back out. The bag is in the archaeological record. It is real, and it is one of the most quietly extraordinary objects in the entire history of Appalachian archaeology. Mammoth Cave is the longest known cave system in the world. That fact tends to swallow everything else about the place. More than 412 miles of surveyed passage, and researchers who have studied the system's geology believe the true extent may be twice that. The cave lies beneath south-central Kentucky, carved by water moving through a limestone belt that runs from southern Indiana through the state and into Tennessee. It is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. It is a national park. It is so large and so complex that no single person has ever seen all of it. The human history of Mammoth Cave begins, according to the archaeological record, around 5,000 years ago. That number requires a moment. 5,000 years ago, the Great Pyramid complexes of Egypt were under construction. The first cities of Mesopotamia were establishing the basic architecture of urban life. In Britain, Stonehenge was being assembled. In Kentucky, people were walking into a cave with torches made of river cane, navigating more than 16 miles of its upper passages and scraping minerals from its walls. Radiocarbon dating of cultural material recovered from Mammoth Cave and nearby Salts Cave, another section of the same karst system, confirmed that this prehistoric use was not episodic or accidental. It was sustained. The late Archaic and early woodland periods of Appalachian prehistory spanning roughly 3,000 years before the Common Era into the first centuries of it, saw repeated, organized expeditions into a cave system of almost incomprehensible scale, conducted in total darkness, for minerals that had no obvious nutritional or agricultural value. The minerals the prehistoric miners extracted were specific: gypsum, mirabilite, selenite, epsomite. These are sulfate compounds, crystalline deposits that form on cave walls as mineral-laden water evaporates. Gypsum can be used practically as a soil amendment and has been used medically in various cultures. But mirabilite, sodium sulfate, has no obvious nutritional value, and epsomite, a magnesium sulfate, functions primarily as a purgative. Neither is a food, neither is a building material, neither is a tool. The most plausible archaeological interpretation is that these minerals held ceremonial significance, that they were used in ritual contexts that required specific substances obtained from specific underground sources. The word plausible matters here. The interpretation is not proven. The preserved artifacts at Mammoth Cave are extraordinary: woven bags, torches, gourd fragments used as containers, woven moccasins. Plant material that has been analyzed to identify the species and the season of collection, and they confirm beyond any doubt that people were systematically mining this cave over an extended period. What those people believed about the minerals they were extracting and what they did with them after they left is not something the physical record can directly state. What the physical record can state is the scale of the operation. 16 miles of the cave's upper passages were covered by prehistoric miners. Over 1,000 archaeological sites exist within Mammoth Cave alone. The density of human evidence underground is staggering by any measure. Patty Jo Watson and Richard Yarnell's investigations of Salt's Cave in the 1960s, published in the journal American Antiquity, recovered preserved botanical material and woven artifacts that remain among the most detailed pictures of prehistoric underground activity anywhere in North America. The preservation in the cave environment, constant temperature, constant humidity, darkness, is so complete that materials that would have rotted to nothing on the surface survived for 3,000 years in essentially their original condition. Think about what that means for a moment. 3,000 years. The woven bag with gypsum dust inside it is 3,000 years old. The moccasin found in the same passage is 3,000 years old. The torch stump, still with traces of char at one end, is 3,000 years old. The preservation is not a curiosity, it is a testimony. The cave held these objects exactly as the people who carried them left them, and when archaeologists found them. They were in the same relationship to each other that they had been in when the last miner walked back toward the entrance. George Crothers at the University of Kentucky, who has published extensively on the prehistoric archaeology of Mammoth Cave, describes the early use of the system before the most intensive mining period as beginning with simple curiosity, people exploring a large opening in the earth, following passages to see where they went. But by 3,000 years ago, he argues, the activity had taken on a different character. The systematic extraction of specific minerals, carried out in organized expeditions across 16 miles of complex cave terrain, reflects something beyond exploration. It reflects a purpose, one that the community above ground considered important enough to warrant repeated investment of time, effort, and significant physical risk. Caving by torchlight is not comfortable. The passages of Mammoth Cave include sections that require crawling, climbing, wading through standing water, and navigating intersections where a wrong turn leads into sections with no exit. A torch made of river cane provides a flame that moves with the holder's movement, throws unpredictable shadows, and burns for a limited time. The prehistoric miners of Mammoth Cave were not wandering. They knew where they were going, and they knew how to get back. This implies familiarity with the system, which implies repeated visits, which implies a community that considered the underground worth returning to across generations. And then, approximately 2,000 years ago, the mining stopped. Not gradually, not replaced by a different kind of use that eventually faded. The systematic expeditions into Mammoth Cave's mineral-rich passages ended, and the cave was not used in the same way again. The communities that had been conducting these expeditions did not disappear. There is no catastrophic population collapse in the archaeological record of the region at this time. People continued to live above the cave. They continued to use other sites. But the 16 miles of passage that had been the focus of organized extraction activity for 3 millennia were simply abandoned. No archaeological evidence explains the ending. The last torch stump found in the upper passages dates to the period around 2,000 years ago. After that, silence, or rather, the absence of evidence, which in a preservation environment as reliable as Mammoth Cave carries significant weight. If people had continued to go into those passages, they would have left something. They did not. Why? The question has no confirmed answer. One possibility is cultural, a shift in belief or practice that made the underground mineral sources less relevant or less accessible within the framework of the community's ritual life. A change in the religious system or in the social structures that organized and funded the expeditions could have ended the practice without any physical catastrophe. Another possibility is environmental, some change in the cave's condition, perhaps a shift in water flow that altered the mineral deposits or made passages harder to navigate. Neither explanation has direct support in the physical record. The mining simply stopped. This is the kind of uncertainty that archaeology is honest about, even when it is uncomfortable. The physical evidence of Mammoth Cave tells a story with a clear beginning, a long middle, and an abrupt end, and then refuses to explain the ending. The bag on the passage floor, the torch stump, the moccasin, all the preserved objects of 3,000 years of organized underground work stop appearing in the record around 2,000 years ago. The cave stays dark. The surface world continues. What does not continue is the relationship. Whatever the underground meant to the communities who organized those expeditions, whatever the minerals were for, whatever the passages represented, whatever experience of contact or boundary crossing the caves provided, that meaning either changed or ended. The system that had functioned for 3,000 years did not survive into the Common Era, except that it did survive. Not in Kentucky, not in the form of mineral extraction, and not under the same cultural framework, but the broader practice, the deliberate entry into the Appalachian dark zone, the production of organized imagery in specific chambers. The treatment of underground spaces as thresholds between the living world and something beyond it persisted. The woodland period petroglyphs found in Tennessee caves predate the Mississippian mudglyphs. The Mississippian art network that would eventually include Devil Step Hollow and the unnamed caves represents, in one reading of the evidence, a continuation of something that the Mammoth Cave miners had begun. The relationship between these different phases of underground activity is not a direct line. Different cultures, different beliefs, different specific practices, but the persistence of the underground as a space of organized human meaning across 2,000 years of apparent interruption in one form and then renewed in another suggests something that no single site's archaeology can fully capture. The Appalachian cave systems were not simply available locations that successive cultures happened to use. They were, by some mechanism of inherited understanding or repeated independent recognition, consistently identified as places that mattered. What the miners were looking for in those 16 miles of Mammoth Cave passage, the symbolic or spiritual weight they attached to the minerals they extracted, is something the physical record can only gesture toward. But there was something else in the Appalachian underground that would eventually provide a clearer window into what the caves meant. A form of evidence left not in the deep dark zone, but in the limestone walls of caves that people continued to enter for ceremonies in the centuries after the great cave systems of Kentucky went quiet. That evidence was written, and it was written in a language that, with collaboration and time, researchers learned to read. The caver found it by following a stream. This is often how it goes in the karst country of the southern Appalachians. You follow water because water made the passages, and the passages are where the caves open into themselves. The stream led into a low crawlway, then a duck under, where the ceiling nearly touched the surface of the water, then a longer stretch of wading, and then, gradually, the way a cave always grants space in its own time, a larger passage, a dry section, a wall that caught the beam of the headlamp at the right angle. Scratched into the limestone surface, in an organized sequence of characters that no casual observer would recognize on first encounter, were a set of marks. Not random, not decorative, structured, deliberate, composed in rows. The marks were in Cherokee syllabary, the writing system invented by the Cherokee scholar Sequoyah between 1800 and 1824, and they had been placed here, in the dark interior of a limestone cave in northern Alabama, in the year 1828. The inscription referred to a stickball ceremony. Stickball, called by the Cherokee Anetso, is one of the oldest and most demanding traditional games in the Americas, played with webbed sticks and a small ball across a large field between teams that could number in the dozens. But stickball in the traditional Cherokee world was not simply sport. It was a form of controlled conflict, a substitute for war, a mechanism for resolving disputes between towns, and a deeply ceremonial event surrounded by ritual preparation, fasting, prayer, and the involvement of specialized practitioners whose role was to spiritually prepare the players for competition. The night before a major stickball game was a night of ceremony, not sleep, and at least some of that ceremony, in at least some instances, took place underground. The 1828 cave inscription in Alabama is one of several Cherokee syllabary texts found in caves across Alabama and Tennessee. They were not discovered all at once, and their significance was not immediately understood. When they were first identified by researchers, the working assumption was that they were historic graffiti, the same kind of name and date marking that littered American cave walls throughout the 19th century, left by explorers, soldiers, settlers, and the merely curious. The syllabary characters looked organized, but without the ability to read them, there was no way to know whether they were meaningful or casual. The understanding changed when descendant community members, specifically Cherokee archaeologists, historians, and language experts, joined the research process. This collaboration, formalized in the years following the broader Southern Cave Art Survey conducted by the University of Tennessee, produced translations that shifted the entire interpretive frame. The cave inscriptions were not graffiti. They were ceremony. The stickball inscription documented a ritual act conducted in a specific underground space for specific ceremonial purposes. Other inscriptions found in the same survey referenced spiritual concepts, named powers or entities associated with the underground environment, and used vocabulary drawn from Cherokee religious practice that connected the caves to the broader framework of Cherokee cosmology. The caves were not simply where these inscriptions happened to be. The caves were why the inscriptions were here. Cherokee cosmological understanding, as documented by ethnographers, beginning with James Mooney's fieldwork in the 1880s and 1890s, and as elaborated by Cherokee scholars in subsequent generations, describes the world as layered. The surface where human beings live sits between an upper world of order and light and a lower world of chaos, power, and spirits. The boundary between these worlds is permeable at certain locations: water surfaces, mountain peaks, and the openings of caves. The underground is not simply the physical interior of the earth in this framework. It is the approach to the lower world, a space governed by different rules, inhabited by different kinds of beings, and requiring different kinds of behavior from human visitors. Caves, in this understanding, are thresholds. Entering them is not neutral. It is an act that places a person in contact with forces that do not operate by the same logic as the surface world. The cold air that pours from a cave mouth even in summer, a phenomenon anyone who has stood at a cave entrance in July can confirm, is not simply geology. It is the breath of something below. The animals that live in caves without eyes, that navigate by sound or chemistry in total darkness, catfish in underground streams, cave salamanders, blind crayfish, are not ordinary animals. They belong to a different category of being. The inscriptions, read through this framework, make immediate sense. The person who wrote the 1828 stickball text in the Alabama cave was not decorating a wall. They were communicating with, or within, a space that their belief system identified as sacred, a space that lay at the edge of the living world and the world of more than human power. The ceremony the inscription referenced was being conducted in the right place for a ceremony of that kind. Jan Simic, an archaeologist at the University of Tennessee who has led the most comprehensive study of southeastern cave art, has described the cave system as a kind of sacred geography, a landscape organized not by elevation or water access or agricultural potential, but by spiritual significance. In this geography, the underground was not beneath the meaningful world. It was part of it, and in some respects the most important part, the place where contact with the deepest powers was possible. This framework helps explain something that the physical evidence alone cannot. Not just why people entered caves, the art and the mining provide their own evidence for that, but why people continued to enter them across such vast stretches of time. The Mammoth Cave expeditions began 5,000 years ago. The Mississippian Dark Zone art was being produced 1,000 years ago. The Cherokee syllabary inscriptions date to the 1820s. These are not the same people, not the same culture, not the same specific beliefs. But across 5 millennia, the Appalachian cave systems were consistently identified as locations where contact with something beyond the ordinary surface world was possible. That persistence, the way the underground maintained its significance through cultural transitions, through the end of the woodland period and the rise of the Mississippian world and the disruption of European contact and everything after, is itself a kind of evidence. It suggests that the caves were not meaningful because any particular culture decided to make them meaningful. It suggests that there was something about the caves themselves, about the experience of total darkness, of moving through the earth, of being genuinely underground in the full physical sense that was recognized across cultures and centuries as significant in a way that demanded response. Alan Kressler, who photographed and documented many of the southeastern cave art sites for the United States Geological Survey, worked in collaboration with Cherokee and other descendant community members on the translations and interpretations of the syllabary inscriptions. He described the collaborative process as one in which the descendant communities brought a context that the physical evidence alone could not provide. Not a definitive explanation of what prehistoric miners or Mississippian artists believed, but a living continuity of understanding that placed the caves within a framework of meaning that had never fully been abandoned. That is a subtle but important point. The Cherokee who wrote on cave walls in 1828 were not making a new use of an old space. They were continuing a relationship with underground places that had, in various forms and under various cultural systems, been part of Appalachian life for 5,000 years. The relationship had changed. The specific beliefs had shifted. The writing system was new. Sequoyah invented the syllabary in the early 19th century, and it was adopted with remarkable speed across Cherokee communities. But the act of going underground for ceremonial purposes, of treating cave spaces as sacred thresholds, of leaving marks on cave walls as part of that ceremony, that was not new in 1828. It was very, very old. The translations also clarified something that earlier interpretations of Cherokee oral tradition had obscured. The stories about caves in Cherokee cosmology, the beings that lived underground, the powers accessible through cave entrances, the specific protocols required for approaching underground sacred sites, were not simply symbolic stories told around fires. They described actual places, specific caves, specific passages. The oral tradition was, in part, a map. This created an unusual situation for researchers. The descendant communities who were helping translate the inscriptions were not simply providing interpretive context for objects their ancestors had made. They were recovering, through the collaboration, a geography that their own oral tradition had preserved, a catalog of underground locations and their spiritual significance that the disruptions of the 19th century had pushed to the margins of community knowledge, but had not entirely erased. Not everything uncovered in the translation process was published. The researchers and descendant communities made a shared decision that certain categories of information, specific ceremonial details, the names of underground powers referenced in some inscriptions, particular aspects of cave theology that remained active in Cherokee spiritual practice, were not appropriate for broad academic publication. They belonged to the communities whose ancestors had written them, and the decision about how to share them, if at all, belonged to those communities. This is not a suppression of knowledge. It is an appropriate boundary. The cave inscriptions were not left for academic archaeology. They were left as part of a living ceremonial tradition, and they remain part of that tradition. What the broader research community learned from the translations, that the caves were sacred thresholds, that entering them was a ceremonial act, that the underground was understood as a space with its own physics and its own inhabitants, is enough to reshape the interpretation of everything else found in the Appalachian cave systems. The mudglyphs at Mudglyph Cave were not decoration. They were ceremony conducted in a sacred space. The organized panels at Devil Step Hollow were not art. They were theology inscribed in a room built for contact with the divine. The mineral expeditions at Mammoth Cave were not extraction. They were something that happened at the boundary of the living world and the world below. These are interpretations. The physical evidence supports them. The oral tradition of descendant communities corroborates them. The syllabary inscriptions confirm that the framework was still operative in the 19th century. None of this is proof in the way that a carbon date is proof. But the question of what people were doing underground is now answerable in at least its broad outlines. What is not yet answerable is a question that lies further back, before the syllabary inscriptions, before the Mississippian Art Network, before even the Mammoth Cave mining expeditions began. Before any of that, the limestone hills of the Appalachians were already old, already full of passages, already shaped by 500 million years of geological process into the specific kind of landscape that made caves possible. And above those hills, before any of the documented cultures, before any of the art or the mining or the inscriptions, there were other people. Who were they? What did they know about what was underground? And what happened to them? The wall appears without warning. This is how most people who have encountered it describe the experience. You are walking through forest on a mountain ridge in northern Georgia. The trees are dense, the light is broken and shifting, and then there is a structure in front of you that should not be there. Not a single stone, not a collapsed building. A wall, low in places, higher in others, constructed from local stone laid without mortar in a line that extends ahead of you and then curves and continues, and curves again, running for a total of 855 feet across the top of a mountain with no obvious destination. Fort Mountain, Murray County, Georgia. The wall is real. It has been there long enough that the trees have grown around it, through its gaps, over its fallen sections. The forest has been reclaiming it for centuries. It is up to 12 feet thick at its widest points and reaches 7 feet in height at its best preserved sections, though much of it stands only 2 or 3 feet tall. Scattered along its length are 29 pits, excavations or prepared hollows in the ground adjacent to the wall, each roughly similar in size, their original function unknown. At one point, the remains of what appears to have been a gateway, a gap in the wall, flanked by heavier stone construction, that once marked an entrance to whatever the wall enclosed or defined. The wall does not enclose anything. That is the first problem. If you follow its entire 855-foot length, it does not form a complete enclosure. It zigzags across the ridgetop in a pattern that baffles every easy interpretation. Too irregular for a standard fortification. No settlement traces inside it that would suggest a defended perimeter. The placement on a narrow, exposed ridge makes it difficult to approach, but also makes it difficult to use as a practical structure of any kind. The 29 pits along the wall suggest that something was once erected above the stone. Wooden posts, perhaps, or poles, that has since rotted away. But what those structures were, and what the whole complex was meant to do, remains, after decades of archaeological attention, unconfirmed. A 1956 archaeological report on the structure, one of the most careful early assessments of the site, concluded that it represents a prehistoric Aboriginal construction whose precise age and nature cannot yet be safely hazarded until the whole problem, of which this is a representative, has been more fully investigated. That was 70 years ago. The problem has been more fully investigated. The nature of the structure still cannot be safely hazarded. Archaeological estimates place the wall's construction somewhere between 500 and 1500 CE, a range of 1,000 years that reflects the difficulty of dating dry-laid stone construction without associated organic material to sample. The wall is Native American in origin. That much the physical evidence supports clearly. Which Native American culture built it, for what purpose, and whether the construction was a single event or accumulated over time are questions the evidence has not yet answered. The Cherokee oral tradition has an answer. It names the builders. In James Mooney's 1902 compilation of Cherokee oral traditions, published as Myths of the Cherokee, there is a reference to what Mooney described as a dim but persistent tradition of a people who preceded the Cherokee in the Appalachian Highlands. The tradition called these people the Moon-Eyed people, Nunyahi in some formulations, or described by their most prominent characteristic: eyes that were sensitive to daylight to the point of blindness, making them strictly nocturnal. They lived, the tradition said, in underground spaces. They built stone structures. And the Cherokee, at some point in the past, drove them out. The Fort Mountain Wall in Cherokee tradition is one of their constructions. It is important to be precise about what this tradition is and what it is not. It is a documented oral tradition from a historical indigenous community with deep roots in the Appalachian region. It is not evidence of a pre-Cherokee European colony. It is not the record of a lost white race. It is not, in its original form, connected to any of the later colonial inventions: the Welsh Prince Madoc, the lost tribes of Israel, the various fantasies of pre-Columbian European settlement that circulated in American popular culture from the 18th century onward and attached themselves to the Fort Mountain Wall like barnacles. The Madoc legend, the claim that a Welsh prince named Madoc crossed the Atlantic in 1170 and settled in the Appalachian region, has no archaeological support. No credible physical evidence connects any pre-Columbian European presence to the Fort Mountain Wall or to any other stone construction in the region. Professional archaeologists are unanimous on this point. The plaque at Fort Mountain State Park that attributes the wall to Madoc is a historical artifact of the park's early interpretation, not a reflection of current archaeological understanding. It is not accurate, and the Appalachian historian has documented clearly how the whiteness attributed to the Moon-Eyed people in colonial-era sources was a later addition to the tradition, an invention of 18th and 19th century interpreters who projected European origin stories onto indigenous oral memory. What the original Cherokee tradition actually records is something more modest and more interesting. It preserves a memory, fragmentary, uncertain, acknowledged by Cherokee oral historians themselves as dim, of an encounter with people who were different, who lived differently, who used the underground differently, who built things that the Cherokee later found and did not always understand. Whether those people were a genuinely distinct pre-Cherokee culture, a divergent branch of an earlier population, or a population preserved in memory as more distinct than they actually were, is not something the oral tradition can resolve. Oral tradition does not work that way. It preserves the outline of an experience, the fact of an encounter, the sense of difference, the outcome of a conflict, not the kind of detail that archaeological dating and genetic analysis can provide. What the Fort Mountain Wall provides, in this context, is a physical anchor for a question that the oral tradition raises. Were there people in the Appalachian Highlands before the historically documented Cherokee presence, whose relationship with stone construction and with the underground left physical traces that later communities encountered and remembered? The honest answer is, possibly, and the evidence is insufficient to say more than that. There are other stone structures in the region. The Appalachian Highlands contain what researchers describe as a scattered pattern of dry-laid stone constructions, walls, enclosures, and arrangements that do not fit neatly into the documented archaeology of any known historical culture. Some of these may be the work of historical Cherokee construction. Some may be the work of other historically documented peoples. Some are undated. Philip E. Smith's 1962 study of Aboriginal stone constructions in the southern Piedmont documented the phenomenon without resolving the attribution problem. 60 years later, the attribution problem is still real. The Fort Mountain Wall occupies a particular position in this broader picture because it is the largest, best preserved, and most directly associated with the Moon-Eyed People tradition and Cherokee oral memory. The wall exists. Its builder is unnamed. The oral tradition names a people who are otherwise invisible in the physical record. Whether those two facts connect, whether the builders of the Fort Mountain Wall are in any sense the same people described in the Cherokee tradition, is something that current evidence does not confirm or deny. What the wall does confirm by its existence is that the Appalachian Highlands were the site of organized, large-scale stone construction by a population whose specific identity the archaeological record has not yet determined. 855 feet of deliberately laid stone positioned on a mountaintop with 29 prepared pits and the remains of a gateway is not the work of an hour or a day or an individual. It required planning, organization, labor, and a clear sense of what it was meant to accomplish. Whoever built it knew what they were doing. They had a purpose, and that purpose is still unknown. The Moon-Eyed People, as a concept in the broader Appalachian historical imagination, have attracted a great deal of the wrong kind of attention. The kind that projects lost European civilizations or supernatural origins onto a fragment of indigenous oral tradition in ways that serve colonial fantasies rather than historical understanding. That attention has made the serious examination of the tradition harder. It has created a situation where acknowledging the Fort Mountain Wall's genuine mystery and taking the Cherokee oral tradition seriously as historical evidence within its appropriate limits requires navigating through decades of accumulated nonsense. The nonsense is worth clearing away because what remains after it is cleared is genuinely interesting. A stone wall whose builder is unknown, an oral tradition that names a nocturnal, cave-dwelling people as its builders, a pattern of underground use across the Appalachian region stretching back 5,000 years, and the persistent question, in all those millennia of engagement with the underground, in all those miles of dark zone cave art and mineral expeditions and ceremonial inscriptions, was there ever a moment when the underground was not just visited, but inhabited? The Cherokee tradition says yes. Modern archaeology cannot confirm or deny it. And one detail from the broader record of Appalachian cave use suggests the question deserves more serious attention than it has typically received. That detail is not from a stone wall. It is from inside the ground, from a cave in Tennessee where something was found that placed a human being in total darkness, miles from any entrance, at a moment in time that remains, in the quiet of the research record, difficult to explain. There is a footprint inside Jaguar Cave. The cave is in north-central Tennessee. The footprint is human, adult-sized, preserved in the dried mud of a passage floor in the cave's deep interior. Researchers from the University of Kentucky Program for Archaeological Research and the Illinois State Museum Society documented it in 2008, along with other preserved evidence of prehistoric human presence in the cave system. The footprint had been there, undisturbed, in a section of the cave that required significant navigation to reach for a period of time that the surrounding geological and archaeological context places in the distant past. A footprint is the most personal archaeological artifact that exists. A pottery fragment or a stone tool tells you that someone made a thing and left it behind. A footprint tells you where a person stood. The pressure of a heel, the arch, the toes, the exact weight and movement of a specific human body preserved in mud in a cave that human beings have not entered in a very long time. When researchers photographed and measured the Jaguar Cave footprint, they were, in the most literal possible sense, standing where someone else had stood and following the same direction of travel. The footprint is part of a larger pattern of physical evidence that the investigation of the Appalachian underground has assembled over decades, and understanding that pattern requires stepping back from any single site and looking at the geology that made all of it possible. The Appalachian Mountains are old, older in fact, than most of the geological features people associate with dramatic antiquity. The Himalayas are 50 million years old. The Alps are roughly the same age. The Appalachians began forming approximately 480 million years ago, and the processes of uplift, erosion, and transformation that shaped them continued for hundreds of millions of years after that. What visitors see today, the long forested ridges, the valleys, the rivers that cut through limestone, is the worn-down remnant of a mountain range that was once as dramatic as the Rockies and has been softening ever since. Beneath those ridges lies a geological formation that is, in its own way, as extraordinary as anything visible at the surface. Approximately 325 million years ago, a large portion of what is now the southeastern United States was submerged beneath a shallow ocean. The creatures of that ocean, small organisms with calcium-rich shells, accumulating over millions of years on the seafloor, compressed slowly into limestone. When the ocean retreated, that limestone remained, buried beneath later geological layers, waiting. Over the subsequent millions of years, as the Appalachian uplift brought rock toward the surface and erosion stripped away the overlying material, the limestone became exposed to the one thing that dissolves it, slightly acidic water. Rain falls through the atmosphere and picks up carbon dioxide. When that slightly carbonic rainwater contacts limestone, it reacts chemically with the calcium carbonate and slowly dissolves it. Over time, deep time, geological time, that dissolution creates cracks, then channels, then passages, then rooms, then cave systems of extraordinary complexity. This process is called karst formation, and the landscape it creates is called karst topography. The Appalachian Karst Belt runs from southern Indiana through Kentucky into Tennessee and connects through the Valley and Ridge physiographic province into Virginia, West Virginia, North Carolina, Georgia, and Alabama. It is not a single feature. It is a distributed geological condition, limestone at or near the surface, water moving through it. Dissolution, creating underground space, that repeats across hundreds of miles of mountain terrain. Where the karst belt runs, caves form. Where caves form, passages develop. Where passages develop, dark zones appear. The distribution of prehistoric cave art sites documented by the University of Tennessee Survey matches the karst belt with a precision that is not coincidental. The Tennessee Encyclopedia entry on prehistoric cave art notes this explicitly. The distribution of sites corresponds to the limestone tablelands of the Appalachian Plateau, suggesting that cave art was produced everywhere caves were available for decoration. Not everywhere that people lived. Everywhere that people lived and caves existed. The underground was being engaged with wherever the geology permitted it. That is a significant statement. It means the 92 cataloged dark zone art sites are not the product of one culture's unusual relationship with the underground, or one region's particular spiritual geography. They are the product of a widespread human tendency, operating across centuries and cultures, to treat available cave systems in a specific way. The practice did not require particular people, it required the right geology. The karst belt also explains why Mammoth Cave is where it is. The cave system sits atop a particularly thick and extensive limestone deposit in south-central Kentucky, within the karst belt's northern reach. The dissolution processes that created its 412-plus miles of passage have been operating for approximately 10 million years, which means the cave system was already ancient, already extensive, already a labyrinth of significant complexity when the first human beings found the entrance 5,000 years ago. The people who began mining its passages were not exploring a new feature of the landscape. They were entering something that the Earth had been preparing for millions of years before they arrived. The same is true of the Natural Tunnel in Scott County, Virginia, a tunnel 850 feet long, up to 200 feet wide, up to 80 feet high. Formed over more than 1 million years of karst erosion as a subterranean stream captured the flow of what is now called Stock Creek and carved its way through a limestone ridge. The walls of the natural tunnel contain fossils, the preserved remains of organisms from the ancient ocean that deposited the limestone, visible now in the cut surfaces of the passage walls. Confederate and Union soldiers used the tunnel during the Civil War because it was already there, already large enough to serve as a thoroughfare, already a feature of the landscape that humans had recognized as useful. Railroad tracks would later run through it. The tunnel predates all of human history in the region by an order of magnitude. The Lost Sea, 140 feet below the surface in Craighead Caverns in Tennessee, is the largest underground lake in the United States, a body of water that sits in a cavern formed by the same karst processes discovered in modern times but used by the Cherokee for centuries. Inside the cavern, researchers found Cherokee arrowheads and pottery. They also found the fossil of a Pleistocene jaguar, an animal extinct in North America for more than 10,000 years, preserved in the cave environment that had kept it intact while the world above changed beyond recognition. The jaguar fossil is worth pausing on. Jaguars ranged across North America during the Pleistocene epoch, the geological period that ended roughly 11,000 years ago with the close of the last ice age. The individual whose bones ended up in Craighead Caverns entered the cave, or fell into it, or was carried there by water and remained. While human civilizations rose and fell on the surface above, while the climate shifted, while the great megafauna of North America went extinct one by one, while the woodland people mined Mammoth Cave and the Mississippian artists decorated Devil Step Hollow, the jaguar fossil lay in its underground lake chamber and waited to be found. The cave preserved it because caves preserve things. This is the consistent and extraordinary fact that runs through the entire investigation of the Appalachian underground. The woven bag from Mammoth Cave, the torch stump, the moccasin, the mud glyph figures, the footprint in Jaguar Cave, the Cherokee syllabary inscriptions. The jaguar fossil, all of these exist in their current form because the cave environment, its constant temperature, its constant humidity, its total darkness and physical isolation from the surface world maintained them against the decay that would have destroyed them in any other context. The surface of the Appalachian Mountains has been farmed, logged, settled, burned, built upon, and remade for thousands of years. The archaeological record of that surface is fragmentary, interrupted, regularly destroyed by agriculture and construction. The underground record is not. Where people entered cave systems and left things behind, those things are often still there. The preservation is not perfect. Water damage, mineral deposition. An occasional flooding can destroy cave sites, but it is, in the context of American archaeology, remarkable. This means that the underground record of Appalachian human activity is, in some respects, more complete than the surface record. 5,000 years of mineral expeditions at Mammoth Cave are documented by objects that could not have survived above ground. Dark zone art that was made in caves across a 6-state region has been preserved for centuries, and in some cases, millennia, by the same conditions that make the caves inhospitable to casual human traffic. The syllabary inscriptions, which would have faded from any outdoor surface within years, remain legible on cave walls in Alabama and Tennessee after 2 centuries. The underground kept things, and the underground kept secrets. The unnamed caves, more than 100 sites left unpublished by name to protect them from looters, are the clearest example of this. Their contents have been documented by researchers working under protected access arrangements. The images on their walls have been photographed and analyzed, but the locations themselves are withheld. The art remains in its original context, in its original darkness, in chambers that fewer than a dozen modern people have entered. The researchers know where these places are. The broader world does not. And within those chambers, some questions remain that neither the physical evidence nor the oral tradition has yet answered. The oldest art at some sites predates the Mississippian period by centuries. The woodland period petroglyphs at certain locations represent a phase of cave use that is distinct from the Mississippian mudglyphs in style, in imagery, and in technique, suggesting that the practice of entering dark zones to make organized images began well before the Cahokian world spread its symbolic language across the continent. How much earlier, and what the oldest images meant to the people who made them, are questions that current evidence cannot fully resolve. The footprint in Jaguar Cave sits at the edge of this uncertainty. It is human. It is old. It is in a section of the cave that required deliberate navigation to reach. Who made it, and why, and what they understood about the space they were moving through, these are the questions that the physical record preserves without answering. The footprint is a fact. The person who made it is a mystery. And somewhere in the karst hills of Tennessee, or Virginia, or Alabama, or the dozens of other places where the limestone runs close to the surface and water has had millions of years to do its work, there are passages that no researcher has yet entered. Cave systems whose extent is unknown. Dark zones whose walls have never been examined. The survey at 92 is not complete. What has been found already rewrites the simple version of Appalachian history, the version in which the mountains were a backdrop, a green and pleasant obstacle, a familiar landscape emptied of deep mystery. The record of 5,000 years of deliberate underground activity, organized across a geological formation that spans 6 states, sustained through cultural transitions that the surface record can barely track, preserved by conditions that kept things intact while the world above forgot them. That record is too large, too dense, and too organized to fit the simple version. What has not been found may be larger still. The investigation has one more layer to reveal. Not underground this time. Not in a dark chamber or a dried mud bank or a passage floor, but in a place that connects the entire story back to where it began, to a Tennessee hillside in the winter of 1980, in a caver's headlamp catching lines in a mud wall that had been waiting, patiently, for a very long time. Go back to the beginning, not metaphorically, physically. The passage is the same passage. The mud slope is the same mud slope. The keyhole is as narrow as it was in 1980, as narrow as it was 800 years ago when someone moved through it by torchlight in the other direction, carrying whatever they carried, heading toward the chamber where they had work to do. The stream still runs at the lower level. The ceiling still drops in the same places. The air is still the same temperature it has always been. The constant, unseasonable coolness of a place the sun has never reached. The figures are still on the wall. They have not changed. No light has touched them between the moment the last artist left and the winter afternoon when the caver's headlamps found them. The wing of the hybrid creature is still where it was placed, traced into dried mud with a finger or a tool at the exact pressure and angle that the artist decided on. The serpentine curve of the other figure still reads as serpentine. The wall still holds them exactly as it was given them, in the precise condition of the moment of completion, 8 centuries ago. This is what it means to return, not to a place you understand better now than you did, to a place that is unchanged and that you understand differently. The investigation that began with a single discovery in a single cave has revealed, layer by layer, a record of human engagement with the Appalachian underground that stretches back 5,000 years and spans a geography covering 6 states and hundreds of miles of connected limestone terrain. What started as an anomaly, art in the dark zone of a Tennessee cave, made by someone who had no practical reason to be there, resolved into a pattern so large and so sustained that anomaly is no longer a useful word for it. This was not an anomaly. This was a practice, continuous across cultural transitions, embedded in the spiritual and ceremonial life of multiple successive populations, and preserved by geological conditions that kept it intact while the surface world above forgot it. Consider what the record actually contains. Mineral expeditions at Mammoth Cave beginning 5,000 years ago, sustained for 3 millennia across 16 miles of passage, conducted in total darkness by people carrying river cane torches and woven bags, extracting substances whose most plausible use was ceremonial. 92 cataloged dark zone art sites across the Appalachian Karst Belt, and the researchers who built that catalog are explicit that the number is a minimum, not a total. Complete ceremonial chambers like the one at Devil Step Hollow, organized around Mississippian theological imagery that connects to a belief system whose reach extended from the Great Lakes to the Gulf of Mexico. Cherokee syllabary inscriptions written inside cave walls in 1828, documenting ceremonial activity in underground spaces that the writers understood as sacred thresholds, portals toward a lower world governed by different physics and different inhabitants than the surface. A stone wall on a Georgia mountaintop that predates all attempts to name its builders, carrying 29 prepared pits along its length and the ruined frame of a gateway. Preserved footprints in a Tennessee cave floor. A woven bag with mineral dust inside it, 3,000 years old, left on the floor of a mammoth cave passage like something set down for a moment and never retrieved. This is not a single story. It is a collection of overlapping records, mineral extraction, ceremonial art, sacred geography, oral tradition, written inscription, preserved artifact, that each describe a different aspect of the same fundamental relationship. The people of the Appalachian region, across at least 5,000 years of documented activity, understood the underground as a place that mattered. Not incidentally, not occasionally. Consistently, deliberately, across every cultural transition the archaeological record can identify. The underground was treated as a space with its own significance, its own rules, and its own relationship to whatever lay beyond ordinary experience. The simple version of Appalachian history, the Green Mountains, the familiar ridges, the backdrop for folk songs and hiking trails, did not include this. It included the surface, the visible, the things that could be found by walking the ground rather than moving beneath it. The underground was assumed to be empty. Geology, water, darkness, nothing more. The physical evidence does not leave room for that assumption, and yet the evidence is not complete. It is, in fact, notably and specifically incomplete in ways that are not accidental. The mining at Mammoth Cave stopped 2,000 years ago, and no explanation in the physical record accounts for the ending. The builder of the Fort Mountain Wall is unnamed, and the archaeological investigations of the site have not resolved the question of who constructed 855 feet of dry-laid stone on a Georgia ridgetop between 500 and 1500 C. The full meaning of the dark zone images, what the artists understood themselves to be doing in those chambers, what they expected to happen, what contact they believed they were making, is accessible only indirectly through the oral tradition of descendant communities and the comparative analysis of related iconography. The specific content of some Cherokee syllabary cave inscriptions has not been published by the shared decision of researchers and descendant communities because it belongs to a living ceremonial tradition that was not written for the academic record. The unnamed caves remain unnamed. Their contents have been documented. Their locations have not been released. Somewhere in the limestone hills of Tennessee and Alabama and Virginia, in chambers that fewer than a dozen modern people have ever entered, there are images on walls that have been in darkness for 800 years, or 1,000, or longer. The figures are there. The walls hold them. The darkness holds the walls. The investigation can describe what was found. It cannot fully explain what it meant. That distinction matters. The difference between describing physical evidence and claiming to know the inner life of the people who produced it is the difference between archaeology and speculation. What the investigation has produced, at its most careful and most rigorous, is a picture of organized behavior, sustained, intentional, geographically extensive, culturally persistent, in a landscape that most people had assumed was used only on its surface. That picture changes the Appalachian Mountains. Not dramatically, in the way that a single sensational discovery changes a headline for a week. Quietly, in the way that understanding something adds weight to it. The mountains are the same. The forest is the same. The ridges are still green, and the rivers still run through limestone valleys, and the Appalachian Trail still crosses the same ground it always has. But the ground has a different depth now. The hills are not simply hills. They are, in some passages and chambers beneath them, the preserved record of 5,000 years of human intent. Of people who decided, across 50 centuries and multiple cultures, that what lay under the surface was worth the difficulty of reaching it. Jan Simic, whose work at the University of Tennessee produced the most comprehensive analysis of the cave art network, described what his team found as evidence of a sacred geography. A landscape organized not by elevation or water access, but by spiritual significance, in which the underground was not a sublayer beneath the meaningful world, but an integral part of it. The caves were not below the sacred landscape. They were inside it. That is the reframe that everything in the investigation points toward. Not that the Appalachian Underground is a mystery in the sensational sense, a conspiracy, a hidden secret, a revelation that overturns history in one dramatic moment, but that the standard picture of Appalachian history, the picture that sits at the surface and does not look down, is missing an enormous and well-documented component. The surface and the underground were not separate worlds to the people who lived in and around these mountains. They were one landscape, organized by a framework of meaning that treated limestone passages and dark chambers and underground lakes as part of the same geography as the ridges and valleys above. 5,000 years of that relationship is not a mystery in the sense of something unexplained. Most of what happened is, at the level of physical behavior, legible in the record. People went underground. They went deliberately, with tools and light, for purposes that exceeded simple resource extraction. They made organized images in specific chambers. They extracted minerals whose most plausible use was ceremonial. They wrote on cave walls in a sacred language. They built stone walls on mountain ridges and described, in oral tradition, a history of the underground that preceded their own. What remains mysterious, what the evidence describes without explaining, is the interior of all of it. What it felt like to move through a keyhole passage by torchlight, knowing that the flame was the only thing between you and absolute darkness. What it was like to reach the chamber and see the walls waiting. What the artists believed about the figures they were making, and what they understood would happen in that space once they left it. What the miners thought when they scraped mineral crystals from the walls of Mammoth Cave into a woven bag 3,000 years ago and began the long walk back toward the entrance. What the Cherokee writer of the 1828 Alabama inscription understood about the underground space in which they were writing and what kind of contact they believed the writing made. These are not questions that the physical record can answer. They are the questions that the physical record, by its very existence, insists on asking. The Mudglyph chamber in the Tennessee hillside is still there. The figures are still on the wall, the one with wings, the one with the serpent's curve, the hybrids that blend the human with the animal in the visual grammar of a belief system that was already old when these specific images were made. No natural light has ever reached them. The cave's constant conditions have held them in exactly the state in which they were left. They have been seen in the entire history of their existence by the artists who made them and by the small number of researchers who have entered since 1980. The mountain above looks ordinary. It always has. It is a forested Tennessee hill, unremarkable from the outside, one of thousands of similar hills in the southern Appalachians. Green in summer and bare in winter, and cut through with the sound of water. You would not know, standing at its base, that the hill is hollow in places, that beneath the soil and the root systems and the limestone bedrock there are chambers with dried mud walls that still carry marks made 800 years ago. You would not know that the marks are there, waiting in the dark, patient in the way that stone is patient, belonging now to the same permanent silence that has always surrounded them. The investigation found them, and found around them 5,000 years of similar intent, reaching back through cultures and centuries to a moment that no physical evidence can quite locate, the moment the first person entered the Appalachian underground and decided that what was inside it was worth the difficulty of going deeper. We do not know who that person was. We do not know what they carried, or what they found, or what they believed about the space they were entering. The record begins where preservation begins, and preservation begins later than the beginning. The hill is still there. The chamber is still there, somewhere below the surface, in a passage that goes further than seems reasonable. The ground keeps what it has always kept.